Family Guy, a show that has been canceled, resurrected, celebrated, despised, sued, banned, threatened, and renewed, all in the same breath, across more than 25 years of television history. There is no other show quite like it. Not because it was the funniest or the smartest or the most original, though at its peak it was all of those things, but because no other animated comedy has ever managed to generate this much fire, this consistently, across this many decades. Every season, without fail, something happens. An episode gets pulled, a lawsuit gets filed, a creator goes to war with his own network in public, a beloved character dies on screen, and the world breaks the internet trying to bring him back. If you wanted to study the complete history of American animated television controversy, now you could almost do it by just watching Family Guy and paying attention to who got angry and why. And tonight, in the quietest possible way, we are going to walk through all of it. Every scandal, every banned episode, every legal battle, every creator meltdown, every moment the show pushed too far or didn't push far enough, and every controversy that made people care just a little more than they probably should have about a cartoon family from a fictional Rhode Island town. Pull your blanket up, let the room get quiet. We are going to settle into this story the way you settle into something long and deeply familiar. And by the time we are done, you will know this show's history better than most people who have watched it since 1999. Section 1. The show that wasn't supposed to exist. The origin controversies. To 1995 to 1999. Before Family Guy ever put a single frame on television, before Peter Griffin had said a single word or Stewie had hatched a single plan, the controversy around the show had already begun. Because the story of how Family Guy came to exist is itself a story about resistance, rejection, and a network that almost didn't let it happen at all. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born in Kent, Connecticut in October of 1973. He was, by all accounts, the kind of person who always knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He had been drawing cartoons since childhood and studied at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is one of the most prestigious art and design schools in the country. While still a student there and then shortly after graduating, MacFarlane landed work at Hanna-Barbera, the legendary animation studio that had produced The Flintstones, The Jetsons, Scooby-Doo, and 100 other cartoons that had shaped the television landscape. MacFarlane worked on shows like Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, and Cow and Chicken. These were solid, respectable credits for a young animator, but he had bigger things in mind. During his time working on these shows, MacFarlane was quietly developing his own characters and his own sensibility. In 1995, while still a student, he made a short animated film called The Life of Larry. The film starred a heavy-set, not especially bright middle-aged man named Larry and his dog, Steve. If you have seen even 10 seconds of Family Guy, the connection is immediately obvious. Larry and Steve would, with some redesigning and renaming, become Peter Griffin and Brian Griffin. The dynamic between them, the slightly oblivious man and the more grounded, intellectually pretentious dog, was already there in embryonic form. MacFarlane followed this up with a sequel short called Larry and Steve in 1997, this one produced by Hanna-Barbera and actually aired on the Cartoon Network's short attention span theater. It was a small thing, a brief window into a world that didn't exist yet, but it caught attention. The right people saw those shorts. Executives at Fox were among them. In May of 1998, MacFarlane was invited to pitch a 15-minute pilot based on his characters to the Fox Broadcasting Company. He was 24 years old. He went in and pitched the concept of a dysfunctional family in a Rhode Island suburb, centering on a lovable but dim father, his reasonable wife, their 3 children, and the family's talking dog. He had specific personalities mapped out for all of them. He had the tone of the humor already established in his head. The cutaway gag format, the rapid-fire pop culture references, the mix of dark humor and surprising heart. Fox gave him the green light. And then the arguments began. Even in those early pre-production days, there were people at the network who were not entirely comfortable with what MacFarlane was making. The humor was darker than what Fox typically aired. The references were more obscure, the content was more adult. Fox at this point in 1998 and 1999 was not the network that would later become famous for running the edgiest animated comedies on television. They had The Simpsons, which had been pushing the envelope in its own way since 1989. But The Simpsons, whatever else it was, had a kind of warmth and family-friendly veneer that made it palatable to a broad audience. Family Guy, even in those early pitches, was clearly more abrasive. The jokes were sharper. The darkness was closer to the surface. But Fox went ahead with it. The show premiered on January 31st, 1999, and perhaps the single best time slot any new show can possibly get on American broadcast television. It aired directly after Super Bowl 33. Super Bowl Sunday is the most watched television event of the year in the United States. Tens of millions of people are already sitting in front of their televisions. Whatever comes on after the game is going to reach an audience that no other show can match. That first episode of Family Guy, titled Death Has a Shadow, pulled in around 22 million viewers. 22 million. For a brand new animated comedy from a 24-year-old first-time showrunner, that was a number that defied easy explanation. It was not just a good debut, it was a historically significant one. But even that early, even with those enormous numbers, the complaints started arriving almost immediately. The Parents Television Council, a conservative watchdog organization based in Los Angeles that had already spent years targeting what it considered indecent or inappropriate content on network television, turned its attention to Family Guy almost from the first episode. The PTC had been founded in 1995 by L. Brent Bozell III and had made its name by filing complaints with the Federal Communications Commission, organizing advertiser boycotts, and publishing detailed rankings of what it called the worst primetime shows for family viewing. By 2000, Family Guy had already made that list. The specific objections the PTC raised in those first years are worth understanding because they set the template for every complaint that would follow across the next 2.5 decades. The council took issue with the show's animated nudity, which appeared in several early episodes. They objected to its profanity, its depiction of violence played for laughs, its sexual humor, and its willingness to mock religious figures and institutions. They were particularly upset by the fact that the show aired in early primetime, when children might be watching, and that its animated format might attract younger viewers who were not the intended audience. The PTC president Tim Winter would later be quoted saying that it seemed as though McFarlane had reviewed the legal definition of broadcast indecency and set out to violate it as literally as he could. Whether that characterization is fair or not, it captures something real about the show's early attitude. Family Guy in those first seasons was not trying to be subtle about its provocations. It was poking at things that other shows wouldn't touch, doing it cheerfully and without apology, and trusting that its audience was smart enough and mature enough to handle it. The problem was that not everyone agreed about who that audience was or should be, or whether the show had a responsibility to worry about it. The FCC received multiple complaints about specific Family Guy episodes in those early years. One episode that drew particular immediate backlash featured Peter and a barbershop quartet dancing their way into a hospital room to inform a patient he was dying of AIDS. The scene was played entirely for comedy, the cheerful absurdity of the delivery contrasting with the devastating news being delivered. AIDS organizations objected to what they called a trivializing and demeaning portrayal of a disease that had taken millions of lives. Frederick S. Lane, writing in his 2006 book, The Decency Wars, The Campaign to Cleanse American Culture, cited Family Guy as one of several television programs he believed were aimed at the darker side of family life. Fox started receiving letters. Sponsors started receiving letters. The PTC organized letter-writing campaigns to try to persuade the network to cancel the show outright. Fox didn't cancel it. Not yet. But the scrutiny was there from the very beginning, the sense that this show was living on borrowed time, that the rope it was walking was thin and stretched high above a ground that was full of people waiting for it to fall. The strange thing, looking back at those early episodes now, is how tame much of the content actually feels in comparison to what the show would later do. The outrage in 1999 and 2000 was responding to a show that was genuinely edgy for its era, but the era was one in which the bar for what counted as edgy on primetime broadcast television was different from where it would be a decade later. The things that got Family Guy on the PTC's worst list in 2000 were things that later seasons would have treated as warm-up material before the real content began. But the controversy of those early years was not just about what the show contained. It was also about what it represented. Family Guy arrived at a very specific moment in American culture, the tail end of the 1990s, when network television was still struggling to figure out what the limits of its content should be, how far adult animated comedy could push, and whether shows like this had a civic responsibility to consider their impact on their audiences. These were genuine debates happening in broadcast boardrooms and at the FCC and in newspaper editorials, and Family Guy was being used as a test case for all of them before it had even completed its first season. The first season averaged around 12.8 million households, which was good enough to rank the show 33rd in the overall Nielsen ratings for the year. That is a solid, more respectable performance for a first season of anything. But Fox was getting nervous about the content, about the complaints, about the advertiser pressure, and so they started doing what Fox has always done with shows that make them nervous. They started moving it around the schedule without warning. In the second season, Fox moved Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9 in the evening, putting it directly opposite Frasier on NBC. Frasier was one of the biggest comedies on American television at the time, a critically beloved, commercially dominant show that had been running since 1993 and was at the height of its popularity. Going head-to-head with Frasier was a losing proposition for almost any show, and Family Guy was no exception. The ratings dropped. Fox moved it again, this time to Tuesday nights, where it competed against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC, which in 2000 was one of the most watched shows in the country. The ratings dropped again. The network kept shuffling the show around without giving viewers a stable night or time to find it. By the end of the third season in 2002, Fox officially canceled Family Guy. It looked at that point like a fairly normal outcome. A show that had generated controversy, attracted audience attention, but ultimately couldn't maintain ratings in the face of tough competition and network mismanagement, got canceled. It happens all the time in television. It was supposed to be the end. There was nothing in the history of American television that would have suggested otherwise. When a show gets canceled, it stays canceled. So the bones get picked over in DVD licensing deals and syndication packages, and the people who worked on it move on to other things. That is how it always goes. Family Guy, as we know now, did not go the way things always go. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love reading those. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It costs you nothing, and it means everything for this channel. Section 2. The Resurrection. Nobody Saw Coming. Adult Swim, DVD sales, and the most improbable comeback in television history. The story of how Family Guy came back from cancellation is one of the genuinely remarkable stories in American entertainment history, and it deserves to be told in full detail because without understanding how and why it came back, you cannot fully understand why so many of the controversies that followed happened the way they did. When Fox canceled Family Guy after the third season in 2002, the show's assets went through the standard process of being licensed to other outlets. Cartoon Network, the cable network that had launched in 1992 and was running its late-night Adult Swim programming block for older viewers, picked up the rights to air Family Guy reruns. They got those rights for what was reportedly almost nothing, because nobody at Fox considered the canceled show to be worth very much. This was a reasonable assumption. Most canceled shows aren't worth very much. Their audiences have moved on. The cultural moment has passed. There is no reason to expect that people will suddenly rediscover something they watched a few years ago and already had access to. Family Guy reruns premiered on the Adult Swim block on April 20th, 2003. And what happened next was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. Within weeks, Family Guy had become the highest-rated show on the entire Adult Swim block. It was not competitive. It was not a pleasant surprise that nudged numbers upward. It was a complete and total domination of the late-night cable landscape. Family Guy's return to television boosted Adult Swim's overall viewership by 239%. Not 10%, not 50%, 239%. That number reflects something more than a popular show finding a new audience. It reflects an audience that had been waiting, quietly and without anyone knowing it, for something to come back. At the same time, Fox released DVD sets of the first and second seasons. The timing was not entirely a coincidence. The DVD release and the Adult Swim premiere happened in the same week, and together they created a feedback loop that the television industry had never really seen before. People who watched the reruns on Adult Swim bought the DVDs. People who bought the DVDs told their friends. The friends watched the reruns and bought the DVDs. Within 1 month, those first DVD sets had sold 400,000 copies. Total DVD sales eventually reached 2.2 million copies, making Family Guy the best-selling television DVD of 2003 and the second highest-selling television DVD ever released up to that point, trailing only the first season of Comedy Central's Chappelle's Show. Think about what that means in practice. There was a canceled show that nobody at Fox thought was worth keeping alive, and the audience for that show, just scattered across the country, watching late-night cable and browsing early DVD shelves, independently and organically created a demand so enormous that the network that had canceled it could not ignore the numbers. Fox had thrown Family Guy away, and the public had picked it up and carried it home and held on to it long enough that Fox had to come back and ask for it. By 2004, Fox made the decision to order new episodes. The revival was announced in May 2004. 35 new episodes were commissioned. The fourth season would premiere the following year. This marked the first time in American television history that a show had been revived based primarily on DVD sales, and a cultural and commercial milestone that said something significant about how audiences were changing and how their relationship to television was evolving in the early 2000s. The fan reaction was enormous. The show had built a cult following during its cancellation years, people who had been talking about it online, sharing clips, spreading its humor through the early internet in ways that were only just becoming possible. YouTube had not yet launched. Social media, as we understand it today, did not exist. But forums and message boards and email chains were already doing the early work of what would later be called viral content. And Family Guy had been traveling through those channels for years, building an audience of passionate, had dedicated viewers who felt a genuine ownership over the show and a genuine sense of vindication when it was announced that it would return. The return, however, came with complications. And some of those complications were the seeds of controversies that would define the show for years to come. When Family Guy was canceled in 2002, the writing staff scattered, as writing staffs always do. Writers moved to other shows, other projects, other studios. They couldn't wait around for a show that might never come back. MacFarlane himself had already begun developing a second animated series, American Dad, which would premiere in February 2005. The gap of 3 years meant that when new episodes of Family Guy were finally produced, they were not being made by the same team that had made the original 3 seasons, and some of the original writers returned. But new writers were brought in too, and new writers bring new sensibilities and new ideas about what a show should be. MacFarlane acknowledged this himself in later interviews, noting that one of the ongoing effects of the show's rocky history of cancellations and revivals was that they were always having to rebuild and restaff the writing room. Each time the show went dark and came back, the creative continuity was disrupted in ways that were difficult to fully repair. You couldn't just pick up exactly where you left off. Things had changed, the writers had changed, the audience had changed, the cultural moment had changed. The fourth season premiered on May 1st, 2005, placed right in the center of Fox's new Sunday night animation domination lineup, alongside The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and American Dad. The show was the star of that lineup, the one that had generated the most buzz, the one that people had waited for. The premiere drew strong numbers, reflecting the genuine excitement of a fan base that had spent 3 years watching reruns and buying DVDs and dreaming about new episodes. But even in those early days of the revival, something was different. The animation looked different. Cleaner, more polished, but somehow less alive. The jokes were different in ways that were hard to immediately articulate. The heart, the specific warmth that had characterized the original seasons, felt slightly thinner. These were small things, easy to dismiss as the natural adjustment period of a show finding its footing after years away. But for viewers who had watched the original seasons closely and loved them deeply, I thought there was something in the air, a sense that the show that had come back was not quite the same show that had left. That feeling, that almost indefinable sense of something being off, was the precursor to years of controversy about whether the revival had preserved or destroyed what made Family Guy special. The debate would sharpen over time, becoming one of the central narratives of the show's second life. But before that argument could fully develop, Another controversy was about to break out, and this one had nothing to do with content or creative decisions. This one was about proximity to death, fate, and September the 11th. Section 3. The Hangover That Saved a Life. Seth MacFarlane and American Airlines Flight 11. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, Seth MacFarlane was supposed to board on American Airlines Flight 11 at Logan International Airport in Boston, Massachusetts. The flight was scheduled to depart for Los Angeles. MacFarlane had been in Boston and was heading home. He had a ticket. His name was on the manifest. Under any ordinary circumstances, he would have been on that plane. He wasn't. And the reason he wasn't is one of those details that seems too cinematic to be entirely real, but is entirely verified and has been confirmed by MacFarlane himself in multiple interviews, including a detailed account on The Howard Stern Show in 2009. The night before his flight, MacFarlane had been out drinking. He stayed out later than he should have. He drank more than he should have. He woke up the next morning with a significant hangover, groggy and disoriented. But he also received incorrect information from his travel agent, who told him the departure time for Flight 11 was 8:15 in the morning. The actual departure time was 7:45. That discrepancy of 30 minutes, combined with the fact that he was moving slowly from the hangover, meant that by the time MacFarlane arrived at Logan Airport and made his way to the gate, it was too late. The gate had already closed. American Airlines Flight 11 had already pushed back from the terminal. MacFarlane went and sat in the airport lounge. He probably felt annoyed about missing his flight. He might have been trying to arrange a later departure. And then, at 8:46 in the morning, American Airlines Flight 11, carrying 81 passengers and 11 crew members, was deliberately crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center by 5 hijackers from the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda. Everyone on board was killed. The plane struck the building between the 93rd and 99th floors. The North Tower burned for 102 minutes before collapsing. The day that followed was one of the deadliest in American history. Seth MacFarlane was alive because he had too much to drink the night before and because his travel agent was 30 minutes off on a departure time. MacFarlane's account of how he found out is almost unbearable in its quiet strangeness. He had settled into the lounge after missing his flight, possibly dozing, and woke up to discover that the first plane had struck the tower. He described the experience years later as surreal in the most literal sense of the word. The plane he was supposed to be on, the one he had physically tried to board, had just been flown into a building. He was not the only well-known figure who had narrowly avoided Flight 11. Actor Mark Wahlberg had also originally been booked on the flight, though he changed his plans the day before and flew to Toronto for a film festival instead. The Frasier creator David Angel and his wife Lynn were not so fortunate. They were on Flight 11 and were killed. The irony of that particular detail is sharp and painful. Angel, the creator of the sitcom that had beaten Family Guy in the ratings when Fox moved the show to Thursday nights, died on the same plane that the creator of Family Guy had narrowly escaped. MacFarlane handled this incredibly close call with notable restraint and groundedness. But he told Howard Stern in 2009 that it rattled him for a few weeks, but that he is not, in his words, much of a fate guy. He didn't believe in destiny or signs or cosmic narratives. He was just a man who had been in the wrong place and then, because of a hangover and a scheduling mistake, was spared. He didn't make dramatic statements about it. He didn't turn it into a defining narrative of his public identity. He simply acknowledged what happened and returned to making his show. There is an additional layer to this story that adds a certain uncomfortable texture to it. The allegations around the timeline of his cancellation are disputed. A set of airline records obtained and cited by various researchers suggests that MacFarlane's reservation for Flight 11 was canceled at 6:34 in the morning, which would mean he was already not going to be on the flight before he even reached the airport. This conflicts with MacFarlane's own account, in which he arrived at the gate and found it already closed. There is no definitive resolution to this discrepancy, and it's worth noting that official records and personal memory of chaotic or distressing situations can diverge in ways that don't necessarily imply deliberate deception. The Wikipedia article on American Airlines Flight 11 confirms MacFarlane's name as someone who had been scheduled to be on the flight and overslept due to a hangover. The precise mechanism of how he missed it may not be entirely clear. What is not in dispute is that he was booked on it and did not board it. The 9/11 connection to Family Guy didn't end with MacFarlane's near miss. That it continued to surface in the show's content over the years in ways that generated their own controversies. After the attacks in September 2001, many television shows pulled or delayed episodes that they felt might be insensitive in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy. The episode that aired as Family Guy's season premiere for that fall was A Fish Out of Water, which aired on September 19th, 2001, just 8 days after the attacks. It was a relatively benign episode, and the show continued its third season run without major incident. But the awareness of how close the show had come to losing its creator hung in the background of everything that followed. Years later, references to September 11th began appearing in Family Guy episodes in ways that were characteristically uncomfortable. That's the show's willingness to approach almost anything as comedic material extended to the attacks themselves, and some of those moments generated real outrage. Critics argued that there are events that belong in a different category from the usual terrain of dark comedy, that the specificity and the still raw grief surrounding the attacks made jokes feel like violations rather than satire. Defenders of the show argued that Family Guy had always applied its darkly comic lens equally to everything, and that making an exception for any particular tragedy was a form of inconsistency. This argument about what is and isn't appropriate territory for comedy is one that runs through the entire history of the show's controversies and has never been fully resolved, because it may not be resolvable. What MacFarlane's near miss on September 11th did to his creative work, if anything, is not something he has spoken about extensively. He has been careful not to mythologize the experience, not to suggest that surviving it gave him some special purpose or permission or responsibility. But the timing of it, occurring as it did in the middle of the original run of the show, during the third season, the final season before the first cancellation, means that it belongs to the story of Family Guy, even if nobody can say exactly how or why. It is one of those details that hovers around the edges of the show's history, making everything feel slightly more precarious and slightly more improbable than it might otherwise seem. Section 4. The Manatee Wars, South Park, the writing room insult, and the bitterest feud in animation history. In April 2006, 1 year after Family Guy had returned from its first cancellation and 3 years after South Park had premiered on Comedy Central, the long-running mutual irritation between the two shows finally became something public, specific, and lasting. South Park aired a 2-part episode called Cartoon Wars, and in doing so, it threw a creative grenade into the middle of the animated comedy landscape that has still not been fully diffused 20 years later. South Park had always been, in some ways, a rival to Family Guy. They were both adult animated comedies that pushed the limits of what broadcast and cable television would allow. They were both willing to go places that The Simpsons, in its more family-friendly mode, would not. They were both cultural phenomena with large, devoted fan bases. And they were both, in the mid-2000s, at or near the peak of their influence. The comparison was frequently made by critics and audiences, and Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who created and wrote South Park, have said openly that they hated being grouped with Family Guy. In various interviews, they expressed what Stone described as a genuine respect for the fact that the show was popular, but a genuine contempt for what they saw as its creative laziness. The Cartoon Wars episodes, which aired April 5th and 12th of 2006, were structured around a controversy about whether an upcoming Family Guy episode would show the Prophet Muhammad on screen, a topic of intense international sensitivity following the publication of the Jyllands Posten cartoons in Denmark the previous year, which had sparked protests and riots across the Muslim world. South Park wove this free speech debate into its storyline, while simultaneously mounting a pointed and detailed attack on Family Guy's approach to comedy. In the episode, the main character, Eric Cartman, visits the Fox studios and is shown the secret behind Family Guy's success. The show's writing staff, it turns out, is not a group of human beings sitting in a room discussing character arcs and story structure and comic timing. It is a tank of manatees, actual sea mammals in a large aquarium. And the manatees write Family Guy by randomly selecting from a pile of beach balls, each inscribed with a noun, a verb, or a pop culture reference. Two balls are pushed together by the manatees, and the combination produces a cutaway gag. The implication was stark. There was no intelligence or craft behind Family Guy's jokes. They were random. They were interchangeable. You could remove any one of them and put a different one in its place, and nothing would change, because none of them had anything to do with the characters, the story, or any actual comedic logic. Cartman, who in the episode doesn't care about Muslims or free speech at all, just wants to get the show canceled because he hates it, delivers the key line. He says he is nothing like Family Guy because when he makes jokes, they are jokes inherent to a story, deep situational and emotional jokes based on what is relevant and has a point, not just one random interchangeable joke after another. The episode was devastating in the specificity of its criticism. It wasn't just saying that Family Guy was bad, but it was saying precisely how and why it was bad, in a way that anyone who had spent time thinking about comedy could immediately recognize as pointing at something real. Cutaway gags, by their very nature, are disconnected from the main story. They interrupt the narrative to deliver a joke that has nothing to do with what was just happening. In the early seasons of Family Guy, this was a feature rather than a flaw, because the rest of the show was strong enough to make the cutaways feel like a bonus. But by 2006, after the revival, critics had started noticing that the cutaways were increasingly becoming the entire substance of the show, that the plots were getting thinner and the characters shallower in proportion to how much the random joke sequences were expanding. Parker and Stone were not just expressing their own opinion. After the first part of Cartoon Wars aired, they received phone calls and flowers from writers on other animated shows expressing their gratitude. Writers from The Simpsons reached out. Writers from King of the Hill reached out. Parker quoted one of The Simpsons writers saying something along the lines of Parker and Stone doing God's work. He described the moment as an animation solidarity event, where everyone in the industry came together over a shared frustration. Parker said the other shows hated Family Guy even more than South Park did. They just wouldn't say it publicly. The reason they wouldn't say it is obvious. You do not publicly attack one of the most successful shows on your network's broadcast schedule when that show is bringing in millions of viewers and generating enormous amounts of money. You might feel privately that the show is coasting on its reputation and getting lazy, but you keep that opinion in the writer's room. Parker and Stone had the freedom to say it out loud because they were on a different network, making a different show, with no institutional reason to protect Family Guy. McFarlane's response to the Cartoon Wars episodes was, in many ways, more interesting than the attacks themselves. He did not lash out. He did not mount a formal rebuttal. At his Class Day address at Harvard University on June 7, 2006, he addressed the South Park parody in character as Stewie Griffin. He said, and this is worth quoting because it is genuinely self-aware, that the cutaways and flashbacks have nothing to do with the story. They are just there to be funny. That is a shallow indulgence that South Park is quite above, and for that, he saluted them. That is a remarkable response. He is essentially agreeing with the criticism. He is saying, yes, the cutaways are random and disconnected. Yes, they do not advance the story. Yes, that is a shallow approach to comedy. And yes, South Park does something more disciplined and more demanding. He said it with enough wit and humor that it read as sporting good nature, but the substance of what he said was an admission that Parker and Stone had identified something real. In a 2012 interview with Rolling Stone, McFarlane called the Cartoon Wars episode funny and accurate. He added that he didn't fully understand the personal venom that Parker and Stone spewed in press appearances about the show and about him in ways that went beyond the context of the joke. He felt the public attacks on his writing staff, specifically, rather than on him personally, were unfair. His writers were working hard and producing what the show called for, and having their work described as the random output of sea mammals was, whatever the satirical intent, insulting to people who were doing a legitimate job. The Family Guy writers themselves handled the manatee joke with a certain amount of sardonic grace. In their DVD commentaries for episodes from this period, writers began referring to their own cutaway gags as manatee jokes. The term became an inside reference in the Family Guy writing room, a way of acknowledging the South Park criticism without fully conceding it, of making it theirs by naming it. There is something almost admirable about that response. If someone is going to permanently define a characteristic of your work with a single image, Also, you might as well own the image. The feud between the shows never fully resolved. In a 2009 episode of Family Guy called Spies Reminiscent of Us, the show took its own swipe at South Park's argument. In the episode, Peter Griffin participates in an improv comedy show. His nonsensical, context-free gags get enormous laughs from the crowd. The other performers, who are trying to do character-driven, emotionally grounded comedy, get nothing. The joke is that random disconnected humor is what actually works with audiences, regardless of what the artistically serious crowd thinks. It was a gentle, self-deprecating counter-argument dressed up as a punchline. In a later episode, Peter makes an offhand reference to a pretty good ribbing by those South Park guys, with enough affection in the delivery to suggest genuine appreciation alongside the bruised ego. Parker and Stone never quite matched this level of magnanimity. In various interviews across the years, they continued to describe their dislike of Family Guy in terms that made it clear this was not just artistic disagreement, but something more visceral and personal. Stone said publicly, for the record, that they had seen Family Guy and they hated it. The two shows have, rather improbably, ended up as neighbors in recent years. Starting in September 2024, Family Guy began airing on the Comedy Central network, which is, of course, the home of South Park. The two shows that spent 2 decades sniping at each other about philosophy and craft are now sharing programming space. What Trey Parker and Matt Stone think about this development has not been recorded in any interview format that was available at the time of this script's research. But it seems safe to assume that whatever they think, they are thinking it with a certain amount of exasperated amusement. The Cartoon Wars controversy matters in the story of Family Guy for reasons that go beyond the specific insult of the manatee image. It matters because it crystallized, in public, and in a way that became permanent cultural shorthand, the central criticism of the show's approach to comedy. Long after Cartoon Wars aired, any discussion of Family Guy's writing quality eventually returned to the manatee. The image had done what the best satire always does. It had identified a truth about its subject so cleanly and so memorably that the truth became impossible to separate from the image. You could defend Family Guy's cutaway gags on 100 different grounds, but somewhere in the back of every defender's mind, there were always manatees, pushing balls together. Section 5, the banned episode that never made it to air, partial terms of endearment and the abortion controversy. Of all the episodes that Family Guy has ever produced, one stands in a category entirely by itself. One episode that was completed, fully animated, fully voiced, fully scored, and then placed in a vault where it has remained for American audiences to this day. Not a pilot that was rejected before production, not a concept that was abandoned in the writing room. A finished episode, ready to air, that Fox decided they would not broadcast. That episode is called Partial Terms of Endearment. It was written by Danny Smith and directed by Joseph Lee. It was produced as the season finale for Season 8, intended to air in May 2010. It tells the story of Lois Griffin agreeing to be a surrogate mother for an old college friend named Naomi and her husband Dale. When Naomi and Dale are killed in a car accident while Lois is pregnant with their embryo, Lois and Peter must decide what to do with the baby. The episode ends with Lois choosing to have an abortion against Peter's wishes. The subject matter was known to be sensitive before the episode was even in production. McFarlane consulted Carl Sagan's essay, Abortion. Is it possible to be both pro-life and pro-choice before beginning work on the script? And not because he was trying to create balanced, nuanced coverage of the issue, but because he genuinely wanted to approach it with some intellectual honesty. Fox executives warned McFarlane, while the episode was in development, that the subject matter raised a red flag. McFarlane proceeded anyway, apparently believing that the network would eventually air it, as they had eventually aired other controversial episodes after initially expressing hesitation. When the episode was complete and Fox saw the finished product, the network exercised its right to refuse broadcast. Fox's statement at the time was remarkably measured. It said that Fox fully supported the producer's right to make the episode and distribute it in whatever way they wanted, but that the network would not air it. The network's president of entertainment at the time, Kevin Riley, was more specific in interviews. He said it was an extremely fragile subject matter at an extremely fragile economic time. He noted that of all the issues the show had touched on, abortion was the one that seemed to generate the most volatility. He was honest enough to admit that the episode itself was actually handled well, but that it felt like it could cause trouble and was just not worth it. Note what Riley was saying there. He wasn't saying the episode was offensive or indecent or beyond the limits of what the show should do. He was saying it was a financial risk. Advertisers who were already dealing with a difficult economy in 2010 did not want to be associated with programming that would generate intense political backlash from either direction on one of the most divisive issues in American public life. Thus, abortion content on primetime broadcast television was essentially guaranteed to generate organized boycotts from one side of the political spectrum, withdrawal of sponsorships, and potentially significant revenue damage. From a purely commercial standpoint, the decision not to air the episode was not about decency. It was about money. McFarlane was unhappy about the decision. He said publicly that times had really changed and that the network was making a choice based on people's current ability to handle and dissect controversial narratives. He drew a comparison to other sensitive topics the show had addressed, including gay marriage and environmental issues, and argued that there was nothing about a woman's right to choose that should be any different. He believed that Fox would eventually reverse course and air the episode, as they had done with When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, another Family Guy episode that Fox had initially refused to broadcast and then later allowed to air. That reversal never came. Fox asked Adult Swim, the Cartoon Network block that had aired Family Guy reruns since 2003, not to broadcast the episode either. Adult Swim complied. The episode aired on BBC Three in the United Kingdom on June 20th, 2010, and was later broadcast in Australia and the Netherlands. In America, it has never been aired on any television network. It is not available on Hulu, which is the primary streaming home of Family Guy in the United States. It has never been on Disney Plus in the American market. It can be found on a standalone DVD release and in certain international streaming configurations, but for an American viewer sitting down to watch Family Guy, partial terms of endearment simply does not exist as part of the series. This is an unusual and significant fact. Family Guy has produced hundreds and hundreds of episodes over its run. Many of them have generated genuine controversy, generated complaints, generated legal challenges. But only one of them has been permanently kept off American television, and it is not the one with graphic violence or the one that mocked a specific religious group, or the one with the transgender storyline, or the one that came alarmingly close to a real terrorist attack. It is the one about abortion, the one that treated the issue with more seriousness and nuance than almost any other episode of the show has treated anything. The one that, by multiple critics' accounts, handled the subject with more care and intelligence than most live-action shows have managed. This tells you something important about where the real limits of American broadcast television lie. The limits are not about what is artistically extreme or emotionally disturbing. They are about what is commercially explosive. A show can push as far as it wants in terms of shock value, dark humor, graphic content. But the moment it engages with a political topic that is actively contested in ways that could cost a network advertising revenue, the envelope closes. Not because of decency, because of money. Before partial terms of endearment, the only Family Guy episode that had been held back from its intended broadcast was When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, the third season episode in which Peter Griffin sings a song called I Need a Jew to the tune of When You Wish Upon a Star from the Disney film Pinocchio. Fox's concern with that episode in 2000 was that it would be perceived as anti-Semitic. The episode aired on Adult Swim in 2003 and on Fox in 2004. After the show had been canceled, revived, and the cultural context had shifted enough that Fox felt comfortable with it. The publisher of When You Wish Upon a Star, Born Company, later sued Fox and McFarlane for copyright infringement over the parody song, alleging that the parody was not actually parodying the original song and therefore was not protected under fair use. In March 2009, a federal judge ruled in favor of Family Guy, finding that the altered lyrics constituted a legally protected parody. Family Guy won the lawsuit. The show also had to navigate the specific and unusual problem of what it could show about real living people. The Carol Burnett situation was the clearest example of this. In an April 2006 episode titled Padarotica, a scene depicted Carol Burnett's famous charwoman character, the cleaning woman she had performed for decades on The Carol Burnett Show, working as a janitor in an adult film store, accompanied by an altered version of Burnett's signature theme music. A character in the scene then makes a vulgar joke about Burnett's trademark ear tug, which she used to wave goodnight to her grandmother at the end of every episode of her variety show. The backstory that emerged from Burnett's subsequent lawsuit is illuminating. According to her complaint, a Fox had approached Burnett in 2005 and asked permission to use her theme music in a Family Guy episode. She declined, as was her right. She reserved the song for personal appearances and did not license it commercially. The show, according to her allegations, then proceeded to write the episode anyway, using a slightly altered version of the music and placing her character in the most demeaning context they could find. Burnett filed a $2 million copyright infringement lawsuit in March 2007 against 20th Century Fox. She alleged copyright infringement, misappropriation of her name and likeness, and violations of her right of publicity. Fox's response was that it amounted to an 18-second scene that was a legitimate parody protected by the First Amendment. On May 26, 2007, a federal judge dismissed Burnett's suit on First Amendment grounds, ruling that the parody defense applied. Burnett ultimately lost the case. Legal scholars debated the outcome. The First Amendment protections for parody are broad in American law, but there are limits. A parody generally needs to be commenting on or taking aim at the original work it is appropriating. In the Carol Burnett case, the show was arguably commenting on Burnett's image and persona, which is what made it parody rather than simple theft. The circumstances surrounding it, specifically the allegation that the scene was written as retaliation for her refusal to license the song, added an unpleasant dimension that the court's ruling could not entirely clear away. Section 6, the South American Shutdown, Venezuela, International Bans. The South American. In the 420 episode, the reach of Family Guy's controversies was never limited to the United States. As the show spread through international syndication, it carried its provocations into markets with very different cultural and political contexts, and the results were sometimes dramatic, in ways that went well beyond a watchdog group filing a complaint with the FCC. The most striking international incident in the show's history involves the country of Venezuela. In 2007, during the 7th season of Family Guy, the show aired an episode titled 420. In the episode, Brian Griffin, the family's talking dog and resident liberal intellectual, leads a grassroots campaign in the town of Quahog to legalize marijuana. The episode follows the campaign's progress, Brian's eventual success in getting a measure passed, and then the unintended consequences that follow. It was, in McFarlane's characteristic style, simultaneously a satirical piece about the hypocrisy of drug prohibition and a fairly straightforward comedy episode about the chaos that ensues when everyone in a small town is high at the same time. In Venezuela, the episode was treated not as comedy or satire, but as evidence of deliberate American cultural imperialism. Venezuela's justice minister at the time responded to the airing of the episode by publicly condemning it as an example of the United States promoting drug use among young people. The minister warned cable television stations operating in Venezuela that they would face fines if they continued to broadcast Family Guy. The network essentially threatened with regulatory action for airing the show. The episode, and for a period, but the show itself was effectively banned from Venezuelan television. This episode of International Controversy is interesting for several reasons. Most Family Guy controversies happen in the United States, where the show is made, where its cultural references are most immediate, and where the debates about free speech, artistic limits, and broadcast standards have their most direct application. The Venezuelan situation was different. It was a government, rather than a watchdog group or a legal entity, taking official action in response to the show's content. And it was doing so in a context where the specific cultural meaning of the content was interpreted very differently than it had been in the country of its origin. In America, an episode about legalizing marijuana is a comedy episode about a social policy debate. In Venezuela in 2007, and under a government that was positioning itself in strong opposition to American cultural and political influence, an animated comedy from America depicting drug legalization as a successful and popular campaign was something else entirely. The minister was not wrong that the episode presented marijuana legalization in a broadly positive light. Brian wins his campaign. The town votes in favor of legalization. The episode treats the existing prohibition as hypocritical and counterproductive. Whether that qualifies as promoting drug use, or whether it qualifies as political satire in the tradition of everything else the show does, depends entirely on who you are and where you are watching from. The Venezuelan ban was not the only international incident the show generated. Over its run, Family Guy has been censored, edited, delayed, or banned in various markets for various reasons. Different countries have different standards for what constitutes acceptable content in animation. And a show that builds its humor on pushing against those standards is going to run into those standards in different ways in different places. Religious content that is acceptable in one context is deeply offensive in another. Sexual humor that is part of the mainstream in one culture is inappropriate or even illegal in another. Political satire that reads as standard comedy criticism in America reads very differently in countries where the political figures being satirized are part of the current government. The show also ran directly into controversy over its treatment of Islam and Muslim characters, most significantly in the season 11 episode Turban Cowboy, which aired on March 17th, 2013. The episode followed Peter befriending a Muslim man named Mahmoud after a skydiving accident. Their friendship develops through the episode until it is revealed that Mahmoud is part of a terrorist cell planning to blow up a bridge. The episode generated criticism even before the unrelated catastrophe that followed, with reviewers pointing out that the storyline essentially confirmed the most seductive and harmful stereotypes about Muslim people. The episode setting up a seemingly warm cross-cultural friendship only to reveal it as a cover for terrorism. But then, on April 15th, 2013, almost exactly 1 month after the episode aired, 2 pressure cooker bombs were detonated near the finish line of the Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds more. The bombing was a real act of terrorism, and in its aftermath, a manipulated clip began circulating online that combined 2 scenes from Turban Cowboy in a way that was never in the original episode. The first scene showed Peter winning the Boston Marathon by driving his car through the runners. The second showed someone detonating explosives with a cell phone. In the episode, these scenes came from entirely separate storylines and were presented in completely different contexts. But edited together, they created the appearance of a depiction of a bombing at the Boston Marathon. The edited clip was promoted by conspiracy theorist Alex Jones on his InfoWars website, where it was presented as evidence that Family Guy had somehow predicted or perhaps inspired the real bombing. McFarlane responded immediately and with unmistakable anger. He described the edited clip as abhorrent. He expressed his sympathy for the victims of the real bombing and made it clear that the suggestion of any connection between a satirical cartoon and a real terrorist attack was exactly the kind of dangerous misinformation that caused genuine harm. Fox removed the Turban Cowboy episode from Fox.com, Amazon, and Hulu. The network stated it had no immediate plans to broadcast the episode again. The episode was eventually restored to most platforms, returning to Hulu in September 2022. But it remains absent from the show's catalog in some international markets, and its history is permanently attached to the real-world event that gave an otherwise unremarkable episode of television a much darker and stranger context than anyone involved in making it had intended. Section 7. The Meg problem, when the show turned on one of its own. There is a specific kind of discomfort that comes from watching a character be abused, not the cartoon violence that is standard in animated comedies, the anvils and the falls, and the exaggerated physical gags that everyone understands are not real and are not meant to convey genuine suffering. A different kind. The sustained, targeted, and increasingly specific degradation of a character as a person, as someone who deserves to be treated as worthless. The kind of abuse that makes the audience feel not just uneasy, but implicated, because the joke requires their laughter, and their laughter makes them part of what is being done. Meg Griffin started on Family Guy as a normal teenage girl. That was the point. In a household containing a reckless man-child father, a capable but often exasperated mother, an awkward and oblivious teenage boy, a supervillain baby, and a talking dog, the oldest daughter being a regular, unpopular, mildly boring high school girl was the setup to a joke. The joke was contrast. Everything around Meg was ridiculous and heightened and dramatic. Meg was just a teenager trying to get through her day, which made her both the most relatable character in the house and the least interesting one, at least by the show's internal logic. In the first 3 seasons, the jokes about Meg were gentle by the show's standards. She was the kid nobody paid attention to. She was invisible at school. She had no real social life. She tried to fit in and failed repeatedly. These were recognizable experiences, things that many teenage viewers had lived through, and the comedy came from the exaggerated version of them rather than from cruelty. Peter was not a great father to Meg in these early seasons, but he was not a cruel one either. He said thoughtless things. He sometimes forgot she was in the room. But there were also moments where he showed real affection, where the underlying love of a father for his daughter was visible through the stupidity and the self-absorption. Mila Kunis took over the voice of Meg starting in the 2nd season, after Lacey Chabert voiced her in the first. Kunis has stayed with the role for the entirety of the show's run since then, and her relationship with the character has been one of the more fascinating subplots of the show's history. She has spoken publicly in interviews about how people would approach her at events and use what she called the catchphrase associated with Meg's abuse, the dismissive line that Peter delivers to signal that the family wants Meg to go away, to her face as though she were the character rather than the actress. The fictional cruelty had passed through the screen and into real social interactions, which is a strange and uncomfortable thing to contemplate. The escalation of Meg's mistreatment began in earnest after the 2005 revival. In the 4th season, the jokes shifted from Meg being overlooked to Meg being physically repulsive. Characters began reacting to her presence with visible revulsion. They made gagging sounds when she entered the room. They openly discussed how unattractive she was in front of her, without embarrassment or pause. This is a meaningful shift in the nature of the humor. Being boring is something a character can theoretically change. Being physically repulsive in the terms the show was setting up was presented as an intrinsic, permanent, unchosen quality. It was who she was. And who she was something everyone around her found disgusting. By seasons 8 through 14, the abuse of Meg had become one of the defining characteristics of the show. Peter committed acts of physical cruelty against his own daughter that went well beyond cartoon slapstick. He would pass gas in her face as a deliberate form of entertainment, not as a gag, but as something he chose to do. He would shove her away when she tried to engage with him. He made statements about wishing she didn't exist. On an episode revealed through a flashback that Peter and Lois had once attempted to abandon infant Meg at a fire station when she was a baby, and this was presented as a punchline. The audience was supposed to laugh at the idea that a father had tried to throw his daughter away before she could walk. The entire family participated in this. Lois, who in the original seasons had been Meg's primary protector and the voice of maternal warmth in the household, became cold and dismissive. Chris, who had once had a normal sibling dynamic with his older sister, began joining in on the insults. Stewie, who in the early seasons barely interacted with Meg at all, turned to occasional casual cruelty directed at her as part of his standard operating mode. The town of Quahog as a whole seemed to have made a collective decision that Meg Griffin was deserving of whatever happened to her. The episode that concentrated all of this into a single, deeply uncomfortable focal point was the Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, which aired in 2011. In this episode, the Griffin family is trapped at home during a hurricane. Meg, after seasons and seasons of accumulated insults and abuse, reaches a breaking point and confronts her family. The scene that follows is remarkable. She tells her family exactly what she thinks of them. She calls Peter a terrible father and describes, accurately and in detail, the specific cruelties he has subjected her to. She tells Lois that she is a worse mother than she pretends to be. She dismantles the family's collective self-image in a speech that is, well, when you watch it knowing what has come before it, genuinely cathartic. The audience watching that scene, fans who had watched Meg be destroyed season after season, felt something shift. It felt like the show was finally acknowledging what it had been doing. It felt like justice, or at least the beginning of it. The character was standing up for herself. The abuse was being named and called out. Maybe, finally, something would change. What actually happens in the episode is among the most criticized story choices the show ever made. After Meg's speech, the rest of the family begins to fall apart. Without Meg as their collective target, Peter, Lois, Chris, and Brian turn on each other. The family dynamic collapses, and the episode ends with Meg voluntarily going to Brian and taking back everything she said. And she accepts that her role in the family is to absorb the abuse because without her absorbing it, the family cannot hold together. She willingly returns to being the punching bag because her suffering keeps the household stable for everyone else. Fans were outraged. Critics wrote extensively about why the episode's conclusion was so troubling. The message embedded in that ending, whether intentionally or not, is deeply harmful. It tells the audience that victims of abuse should accept their victimhood because their suffering serves a functional purpose. It says that standing up for yourself is selfish when the people hurting you have come to depend on your compliance. And it says that the correct response to years of mistreatment is to quietly return to being mistreated so that the people who are hurting you don't have to deal with the consequences of their own behavior. This is not a fictional exaggeration of a social dynamic. It is a recognizable template for how abuse is sustained in real families, real relationships, and real lives. And the show presented it as the resolution to the story. Seahorse Seashell Party consistently ranks among the most disliked episodes in the show's history, not because it was poorly made in a technical sense, but because of what it chose to say. The writers clearly knew how to write Meg with dignity and self-awareness. They proved it in that speech. And then they took everything the speech had built and dismantled it in the last 5 minutes. The situation with Meg did eventually improve, at least somewhat. Around seasons 14 and 15, the sustained abuse began to decrease. The addition of more women to the writing staff is credited in various accounts with having pushed back against the ongoing cruelty toward the show's main female teenage character. Meg began getting episodes where she was competent, tough, and capable of genuine strength. In a Simpsons crossover episode in season 13, she meets Lisa Simpson, who encourages her and helps her discover a talent for saxophone. In a season 14 episode titled Peter's Sister, the show attempts to explain Peter's cruelty toward Meg by revealing that his own sister physically and emotionally abused him when they were growing up, and that he has been perpetuating that cycle of harm onto his own daughter. Now, Peter and Meg have a genuine emotional reconciliation. It is a well-written episode with real depth. And then, as the show so often did with any moment of genuine growth, the very next episode reset everything. Peter was back to treating Meg with contempt. The reconciliation had not happened. The cycle continued. By season 22, the extreme abuse had largely disappeared from the show. But the damage to the character's reputation and the damage the years of sustained cruelty had done to viewers' relationship with the show was not something that could simply be undone by being kinder in later seasons. For roughly 10 years, Meg Griffin was defined entirely by her suffering. She was not a character. She was a device. And the specific nature of what was done to her, the sustained multi-season, building to a crescendo degradation of a young woman's dignity, was not something the show could retroactively reframe as harmless. Section 8. The night the internet broke. Brian Griffin dies, and the world loses its mind. There are moments in television history that stop time. Not many. The list of episodes that genuinely shocked their audiences in real time, that made millions of people simultaneously lean forward in their seats or reach for their phones to see if what they had just seen was actually what had happened, is short and specific. On November 24th, 2013, Family Guy added itself to that list. The episode was the 6th of season 12. It was called Life of Brian. It opened in a perfectly normal way, Brian and Stewie messing around with the time machine, getting into the kind of trouble they always got into, fixing things and coming back to the present. When they returned from their adventure, Stewie made a decision that had been building for a while. He destroyed the time machine. He was tired of things going wrong every time they used it. He smashed it and hauled it to the junkyard. Done. No more time travel. The rest of the opening act was domestic and low-key. The family found a street hockey net in the junkyard and brought it home. The first time they set it up in the street in front of the house, Stewie went inside to get his knee pads, and Brian was standing in the road. A car came around the corner too fast. It hit Brian. It kept going. The scene that followed was played with almost no comedy at all, which was disorienting in a show that had spent 14 seasons finding the laugh in everything. Brian was critically injured. How the Griffin family gathered around him in the hospital. His injuries were fatal. The show did not cut away, it did not make a joke. The family said their goodbyes. Before he died, Brian told them he loved them. And then Brian Griffin was gone. The episode continued. Stewie blamed himself and his destroyed time machine. He tried to rebuild it to go back and fix things, but couldn't get the parts he needed. The Griffins held a funeral. A month passed. The family, in their grief, adopted a new dog. His name was Vinny, and he was voiced by Tony Sirico of The Sopranos. He was Italian, he was loud, and he was, in his own way, charming. The episode ended with Stewie, who had been resistant to Vinny, opening up to him about his grief over Brian, and Vinny offering the kind of comfort that only came from someone who had also lost someone important. Within hours of the episode airing, the internet was in chaos. The hashtag RIP Brian became a trending topic almost immediately. The hashtag BringBackBrian was mentioned at least 6,000 times within the first hour of the broadcast, according to tracking data from the time. A petition on change.org titled Seth MacFarlane and Fox Broadcasting Company Bring Brian Griffin Back to Family Guy appeared within hours and attracted over 120,000 signatures within the first few days, making it one of the fastest-growing entertainment petitions in the site's history. Facebook pages dedicated to mourning Brian and demanding his return accumulated hundreds of thousands of followers within days. MacFarlane's own production company received hostile messages. Threatening messages were sent to Family Guy's social media accounts. Some fans said they would stop watching. Others said the show was dead to them without Brian. The outcry was, as MacFarlane would later describe it, rage that he genuinely had not anticipated at the scale at which it arrived. The show's official Fox account tweeted a picture of Brian with the hashtags RIP Brian and Family Guy after the episode aired, which read as a genuine acknowledgement of the character's death. MacFarlane tweeted something that expressed gratitude for how much people cared about the character. The entire week following the episode was dominated by coverage of Brian's death across entertainment news sites, mainstream news outlets, and social media. Steve Callahan, one of the show's executive producers, gave an interview to Entertainment Weekly in which he said the idea to kill off Brian had been pitched in the writer's room and had caught fire, and that the team thought it could be a fun way to shake things up. He framed it as a legitimate creative risk. Brian was chosen, he explained, because it seemed more in the realm of reality that a dog would get hit by a car than if one of the kids died. 3 weeks later, on December 15, 2013, in the episode Christmas Guy, Stewie encounters an alternate version of himself from a different timeline. This alternate Stewie has a time travel device. Stewie uses it to go back to the moment in the street before the car comes around the corner and pushes Brian out of the way. Brian lives. The hockey net is pushed into the trash. The timeline adjusts. When Stewie comes back to the present, Brian is there, alive and confused about why Stewie is hugging him so hard. MacFarlane then tweeted, and this tweet has been widely shared in the years since, a message that said, "And thus endeth our warm, fuzzy holiday lesson. Never take those you love for granted, for they can be gone in a flash." He added, "I mean, you didn't really think we'd kill off Brian, did you? Jesus, we'd have to be effing high." The reaction to Brian's return was, as might have been expected, complicated. A significant portion of the fan base was relieved and delighted. Brian was back. The natural order was restored. Stewie and Brian could have their adventures again. The show would be what it had always been. Another portion of the fan base was genuinely angry, while feeling that the entire exercise had been a cheap rating stunt that had manipulated their emotions for the purpose of generating buzz and viewership without any real creative substance behind it. If Brian's death was never meant to stick, then the grief it produced in millions of viewers had been induced under false pretenses. MacFarlane was candid about the intent in subsequent interviews. He told reporters that based on the numbers, the stunt had helped because it did what it was designed to do. It reminded people that Family Guy was still a show where anything could happen. He expressed genuine surprise at how angry people had gotten, saying that the team was surprised in a good way, that people still cared enough about the character to be that angry. He had wanted to create a stir. He had not fully anticipated the scale of the rage. But the argument about whether Brian's temporary death was a legitimate creative choice or a cheap, manipulative stunt has never been fully resolved, because it depends on what you believe television is for and what relationship a show owes its audience. If a show's primary obligation is to surprise and provoke, then doing something shocking and then undoing it when it generates the desired response is a valid, if cynical, approach. If a show's primary obligation is to honor the emotional investment of its viewers, then inducing genuine grief over a character death that was never going to be permanent is a form of bad faith. What is not disputed is that the Life of Brian episode is one of the most significant moments in the show's history, not because of its lasting narrative consequences, since there were essentially none, but because of what it revealed about where the show was in 2013. It revealed a writer's room that was willing to make a large, bold, attention-getting gesture and then walk it back almost immediately. It revealed a creator who had become comfortable framing his artistic choices primarily in terms of their commercial impact. And it revealed an audience whose attachment to these characters was still deep and real and capable of producing genuine emotional responses, even after 14 seasons and several years of creative decline. People cared about Brian. They cared enough to sign 100,000 petitions and send thousands of tweets in an hour, and threatened to stop watching a show they had watched for over a decade. That level of emotional investment is not nothing. Section 9. The Creator versus the Network. Seth MacFarlane's public war with Fox. The relationship between Seth MacFarlane and Fox has always been more complicated than the standard creator-network dynamic. Most showrunners have tensions with their networks. Creative people who want to do what they want to do and business people who need to manage risk and revenue are going to disagree. That is the nature of commercial television. But most of those disagreements happen in private, in conference rooms, through agents and lawyers and carefully worded statements. MacFarlane's disagreements with Fox happened on Twitter, in Harvard speeches, in Rolling Stone interviews, and in public statements that were picked up and widely reported across the entertainment press. But the first major public tension came during the 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike. MacFarlane was a strong and vocal supporter of the striking writers. The WGA went on strike in November 2007 because writers were fighting for better compensation, particularly around residuals from DVD sales and the emerging world of digital distribution, which the studios were insisting were experimental and therefore not subject to the existing compensation structures. The strike lasted until February 12, 2008, disrupting production on dozens of television shows and several film productions. During the strike, Fox made the decision to air 3 episodes of Family Guy that had already been completed before the work stoppage began. Fox technically had the right to do this. The episodes were finished product that the network had paid for. But airing them against the wishes of the show's creator, during a labor action he was publicly supporting, left a bad taste. MacFarlane was seen on the picket lines. He was an advocate for the writers' cause, and the network was essentially using his show as programming filler during the dispute over his objection. This was not a secret or a matter of disputed record. It happened in plain sight, and it established a pattern that would define MacFarlane's relationship with Fox for years. The network doing what was commercially advantageous, MacFarlane objecting publicly, and the show continuing to air because neither party had the ability or the inclination to fully walk away from the arrangement. The deeper ideological tension in MacFarlane's relationship with Fox was the simple fact that Fox, the broadcast network, the one that aired Family Guy, shared its corporate parentage with Fox News. This was the arrangement that existed until Disney's acquisition of Fox's entertainment assets was completed in 2019. Fox Broadcasting and Fox News, while legally and operationally separate, were connected through the larger Murdoch-controlled Fox Corporation. They shared an identity in the public mind. Being associated with Fox meant being associated with Fox News. MacFarlane found this increasingly unbearable. He is, by any measure of his public statements and his show's content, a committed political liberal. He uses his shows and his social media presence to advocate for science, for environmental protection, for progressive social policy. He has been consistent about this for his entire career, being the creator of a flagship program on a network whose cable news sibling was, by any objective measure, one of the most prominent forces in conservative American media was a contradiction he could not ignore. The specific target of his public anger was Tucker Carlson, the Fox News host who hosted the most watched cable news program in the country from the mid-2000s until his eventual departure from the network in 2023. In June 2018, McFarlane tweeted that he was embarrassed to work for Fox after Carlson told his viewers to assume the opposite of whatever they were being told by major news outlets. McFarlane described this as telling people not to think critically, not to consult multiple news sources, and in general, not to use their brains. He called it fringe and said it was the kind of thing that made him embarrassed to work for the company. The tweet was later deleted, but not before it had been widely captured and reported. It was a striking thing for a sitting showrunner to say about his own employer on a public platform. Fox's response came from Michael Tamaro, a senior vice president at Fox News, who noted pointedly that McFarlane was apparently not quite embarrassed enough not to cash the check, which was, whatever else it was, an honest observation. In January 2020, McFarlane signed a massive overall deal with NBC Universal, the Comcast-owned media conglomerate that operated NBC, several cable networks, and Universal Pictures. The deal was reported to be worth approximately $200 million over 5 years. This moved McFarlane's production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, away from its decades-long relationship with Fox's studio infrastructure. His newer projects, including The Orville, which had moved from Fox to Hulu, and the Ted prequel series for Peacock, were now being developed and produced through the NBC Universal system. Family Guy remained at Fox. The show had been sold to and licensed by Fox under agreements that predated McFarlane's new deal, and extricating it from that arrangement was not something McFarlane could simply do unilaterally. He was contractually obligated to continue voicing the show's characters. Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire were all his voices, and the show could not function without him in the recording booth. He was trapped in an arrangement he had outgrown. In August 2021, during a period when Tucker Carlson was generating controversy with commentary about COVID-19 vaccines and mask mandates, McFarlane tweeted again, "Tucker Carlson's latest opinion piece once again makes me wish Family Guy was on any other network. Look, Fox, we both know this marriage isn't working anymore. The sex is only once a year, I don't get along with your mother, and, well, I've been having an affair with NBC." He compared his relationship with Fox to a failing marriage and made explicit reference to his NBC Universal deal. The tweet was widely covered. It was the clearest and most public statement McFarlane had ever made about his desire to be separated from Fox, and it came with the added dimension of a direct reference to Carlson by name. The irony embedded in all of this is considerable. While McFarlane had built his career and his fortune on Fox, the network had taken a chance on a 24-year-old animator's pitch in 1998 and given it a post-Super Bowl premiere and a primetime slot. Without Fox, Family Guy would not exist in any form. The very success that had made McFarlane wealthy and famous enough to sign a $200 million deal with NBC was a success that Fox had made possible. And now he was publicly wishing the show was anywhere else. The whole episode says something broader about the internal tensions of commercial television, about how a show and its creator can become so commercially valuable that neither can walk away, and so creatively and ideologically mismatched that neither wants to stay. Family Guy at Fox was like a business arrangement that had long since stopped being a creative relationship, and the show continued to be produced. McFarlane continued to voice his characters. The checks continued to be cashed on both sides. But the marriage metaphor he used was apt. Both parties knew the real relationship was over. Section 10. The episodes. They almost didn't make it through, a tour of specific controversies. Across more than 25 years and over 450 episodes of Family Guy, there have been specific moments that generated controversies, intense and particular enough to deserve their own section. Not banned episodes, not legal battles, not network disputes, but individual scenes, jokes, and story choices that crossed lines in ways that produced real, measurable backlash. and in some cases genuinely changed the conversation around what the show was allowed to do. The 2010 episode Extra Large Medium is a good place to start. In the episode, Chris Griffin goes on a date with a girl named Ellen who has Down syndrome. In the course of the episode, Ellen mentions that her mother is a former governor of Alaska. This was a direct reference to Sarah Palin, who had been John McCain's running mate in the 2008 presidential election, and whose son Trig has Down syndrome. Bristol Palin, Sarah Palin's daughter, wrote a piece on her mother's Facebook page criticizing the episode for mocking her brother. She said that the writers of what she called a particularly pathetic cartoon show had tried to be clever in mocking her brother and her family and had failed. As the piece attracted significant media coverage and reignited debates about what was and wasn't acceptable territory for political satire that used real individuals and their families as material. The specific complexity of the extra-large medium controversy was that the character Ellen was voiced by Andrea Faye Friedman, an actress who herself has Down syndrome. Friedman responded to the Palin criticism directly and publicly, saying that she played a mean-spirited girl and that it was just a TV show. She expressed frustration with the suggestion that people with Down syndrome needed to be protected from appearing in comedy, arguing that this attitude was itself a form of condescension. The show had deliberately cast an actress with Down syndrome to voice the character, a decision that looked very different from the outside than it did from within the production. The debate around the episode was, in this sense, a genuinely complicated one, involving questions about representation, the appropriateness of political satire that involves real people's children, and the difference between mockery and inclusion. The Season 8 episode, Quagmire's Dad, became one of the show's most persistently cited controversies around its treatment of transgender characters. In the episode, Glenn Quagmire's father Dan visits the family and reveals that he has undergone gender reassignment surgery and is now living as a woman named Ida Davis. The episode attempts to make substantive points about transgender acceptance, and several characters defend Ida and condemn prejudice against her. But it also includes a scene in which Brian accidentally sleeps with Ida and, upon learning she is transgender, becomes violently ill. The vomiting scene, extended and detailed, was described by advocacy groups and critics as undercutting whatever positive messaging the episode was attempting to build. Jell-Aid issued a statement expressing serious concern. The writer Brent Hardinger, reviewing the episode for AfterElton.com, gave it a negative assessment and said he found it impossible to reconcile the episode's stated intentions with the actual content of the vomiting scene. McFarlane, who has been consistently and publicly supportive of LGBTQ rights throughout his career, and who has made the inclusion of gay and lesbian characters in storylines. A feature of his shows since the beginning, found himself in the unusual position of having produced a transgender episode that the transgender community broadly considered harmful. The contradiction was not one he resolved cleanly in public statements. The episode exists, the vomiting scene exists, and the criticism of it, as shockingly insensitive, has not faded. The Season 13 episode The Simpsons Guy was a feature-length crossover special between Family Guy and The Simpsons. It was, by any measure, a significant event in the history of animated television. Two of the most successful and longest-running animated comedies ever made, sharing a universe, sharing an episode, having their characters interact and talk to each other. Peter Griffin met Homer Simpson. Stewie Griffin met Bart Simpson. Brian met Santa's Little Helper. The episode was watched by millions of people and generated enormous cultural interest. It also generated a specific controversy. In a scene where Bart is teaching Stewie about prank phone calls, Stewie calls Moe's Tavern. The punchline of the call involves a reference to rape. The Parents Television Council flagged the joke immediately. Tim Winter, the PTC president, issued a statement expressing concern about the potential impact of a rape joke delivered as casual comedy in a show that aired in prime time and was watched by a significant number of younger viewers alongside its adult audience. The Simpsons crossover was, on one level, a celebration of how beloved and durable these two shows had become. On another level, it was a demonstration of how reflexively the Family Guy writing room would reach for the most provocative available material, even in a context where the production had so much invested in making the crossover work as a positive event. The 2014 episode A Fistful of Meg from Season 12 generated a PTC complaint in November 2013 that cited what the council described as lewd sexual content and what it considered profane jokes about subjects including child molestation, exploitation, rape, and the sexualized use of food. The complaint was filed formally with the FCC, one of the numerous FCC complaints the show had accumulated since its premiere. The episode also featured the main plot of a boy bullying and physically attacking a female classmate, which the PTC considered an irresponsible treatment of school violence. As Family Guy's lawyers, by this point, had extensive experience with FCC complaints and PTC filings. The show had been navigating these challenges since 2000 and had developed institutional expertise in handling them without losing the material they had produced. The Season 13 episode, The 2,000-Year-Old Virgin, in which Jesus Christ is depicted as still a virgin, and Peter takes him on a night out to help him lose his virginity, generated backlash from Christian groups and some conservative media outlets. The show had been depicting religious figures in irreverent ways since its first season. Jesus had appeared in Family Guy multiple times over the years, always in contexts that would be considered disrespectful by devout believers. Thus, the 2,000-Year-Old Virgin episode was more sustained in its treatment of Christ as a comedic character than most previous episodes had been, making Jesus the focal point of a full storyline rather than a one-off gag. The Road to Germany episode from Season 7 placed Brian and Stewie in World War II Germany during the Holocaust. The show's main Jewish recurring character, Mort Goldman, accidentally travels back in time with them. The episode was praised by some critics for being genuinely funny despite its uncomfortable setting, and criticized by others for finding comedy in one of the most devastating events in human history, in a way that required the presence of a Jewish character to make the contrast work. The complexity of comedy about historical atrocity is one of the oldest debates in comedy writing, and Family Guy has never found a way to engage with it that satisfies everyone. The question of whether you can make jokes about events like the Holocaust is one that has no clean answer, and the show's approach of simply doing it and waiting to see who objected was consistent with its overall posture toward sensitive material. The Season 9 episode Brian Writes a Bestseller is worth mentioning in a different context, as an episode that generated internal fan controversy rather than external public outrage. The episode depicts Brian Griffin becoming successful and then immediately turning into an arrogant, selfish person who mistreats everyone around him, including Stewie, who inspired and encouraged him. Fan response to the episode was strongly negative, not because of any social issue, but because it represented the character of Brian becoming genuinely contemptible in ways that the audience found hard to forgive. Many fans cite it as a turning point in their relationship with the character, the moment when Brian's drift away from his original personality became irreversible. This kind of fan-driven controversy rooted not in content but in character, is different from the other controversies in this section, but it is in its own way just as significant. The outrage of the Parents Television Council was always externally sourced, always coming from people who had a pre-existing framework for objecting to content they found indecent. The outrage of fans who had watched Brian Griffin transform from the show's moral anchor into something unrecognizable was coming from inside the relationship. These were people who had loved the show and felt let down by it. That distinction between the outrage of critics and the grief of fans is one of the things that makes Family Guy's controversy history unlike that of almost any other show. It had enemies from the start, people who wanted it gone and worked to make that happen. And it had a devoted fan base that sometimes found itself more disturbed by what the show became than by anything any watchdog group had ever said about it. Section 11. The numbers and what they say, ratings, renewals, and the business of a show nobody can quite let go of. There is one way to measure the impact of all these controversies that doesn't depend on critical opinion or fan reaction or the positions of advocacy groups. The ratings tell a story that is, in some ways, more honest than any of the other stories, because ratings are just numbers. They record, as precisely as the technology allows, how many people chose to watch. Family Guy's first episode, which aired after Super Bowl 33 in January 1999, pulled in approximately 22 million viewers. That number benefited enormously from the Super Bowl lead-in, but the rest of the first season averaged around 12.8 million households, which was strong enough to rank the show 33rd in the overall Nielsen ratings for the year. This was a genuinely good performance for a new show. The show was connecting with a large audience. The cancellation years came not because of ratings problems specifically, but because of scheduling volatility. Fox moved the show so many times so quickly that the audience couldn't find it. Put against Frasier on Thursday nights, it lost. Put against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on Tuesday nights, it lost. These were not losses that reflected the show's quality. They reflected the impossibility of competing against the biggest shows in the country in slots where the show had no established audience. When the show returned in 2005 for its fourth season, it averaged around 7.9 million viewers. That was an impressive number for a show that had been canceled and was returning after 3 years. The fan base that had been built during the Adult Swim years showed up in numbers. But from that point, the gradual decline began. The drop was not dramatic year over year, it was steady and persistent. Season 13, running from 2014 to 2015, averaged approximately 5.86 million viewers. That was already a significant decline from the nearly 8 million who had watched the revival. The audience had been losing roughly 2 million viewers over the span of 9 seasons. And then the decline accelerated. By season 20, the numbers had fallen to an average of 1.31 million viewers, with a 0.45 rating in the 18 to 49 demographic that advertisers use as their primary measure of commercial value. From 7.9 million to 1.31 million is a loss of more than 80% of the audience. And then it kept going. Season 23 averaged just 723,000 viewers with a 0.19 rating in that key demographic. Less than 750,000 people were watching new episodes of a show that had once attracted nearly 8 million viewers per episode and had, at its peak, pulled in 22 million in a single night. The network's treatment of the show reflected this decline in ways that had their own symbolic weight. Family Guy had aired on Sunday nights as part of Fox's animation domination block for most of its run. Sunday night was the premium slot. It was the night when The Simpsons anchored the lineup and the other animated comedies benefited from the audience that gathered for the flagship. Being part of animation domination was a statement of prestige and commercial viability. In 2019, Family Guy was moved from its long-held 9 p.m. position to 9:30, the second slot. That was the first real signal that the network was reconsidering the show's place in the hierarchy. Then, for the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, Family Guy and Bob's Burgers were moved off of Sunday animation domination entirely. Their spots were given to other programming. When Family Guy returned to the Fox schedule, it aired on Wednesday nights. Wednesday? A weekday. The last time Family Guy had aired on a weekday was in 2002 during the period of scheduling chaos that had preceded its first cancellation. Being moved from Sunday primetime to Wednesday is, in the language of broadcast television, a demotion. It means the network no longer considers you a centerpiece. You are being maintained rather than promoted. And yet, despite all of this, the show was renewed. In January 2023, Fox renewed Family Guy for its 22nd and 23rd seasons. In April 2025, a mega deal was announced with parent company Disney that renewed the show for 4 more seasons through the 2028 to 2029 television season, which would coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season under the new deal would consist of 15 episodes. The disconnect between those two facts, the cratering ratings and the ongoing large-scale renewal deals, requires understanding how animated comedy economics work. Family Guy is cheap to produce compared to live-action television. There are no elaborate sets, no expensive location shoots, no large on-screen cast to pay. The voice actors record in isolation. The animation is produced overseas. The overhead is manageable. On top of that, Family Guy has enormous residual value in its library. It airs on Adult Swim, Comedy Central, FXX, and other cable networks. It streams on Hulu. It generates merchandise revenue from t-shirts, toys, mugs, video games, and a staggering array of licensed products. A Family Guy pinball machine exists. Family Guy video games have been released across multiple console generations. The money the show makes does not come primarily from its current first-run broadcast performance. It comes from the value of 25 years of accumulated content, a library with hundreds of episodes, a globally recognized brand, and an ecosystem of products and licensing deals that continue generating revenue long after any individual episode has aired. As long as those economic facts remain true, the show will continue to exist, regardless of whether 700,000 or 7 million people tune in on Wednesday nights. This is perhaps the final and most durable controversy attached to Family Guy. Not any specific episode, not any specific joke, but the broader question of whether a show should exist simply because it can, whether the commercial logic of keeping a profitable legacy property in production is sufficient justification for doing so when the creative energy that made it worth keeping alive has long since gone elsewhere. MacFarlane himself addressed this question in an April 2024 interview. He said he didn't see a good reason to stop making the show because people still loved it and because it made people happy and helped fund causes he cared about, like environmental conservation through organizations like the Rainforest Trust. He said there had been a time when he thought it was time to wrap things up, but that the show had reached what he called escape velocity, meaning it had been going so long that there was no logical reason to end it unless the audience stopped caring. But he framed the show's continued existence in terms of financial utility and audience demand. That is a very different kind of statement from the energy of a creator who is excited about what he is making. It is the statement of someone managing a valuable asset, making sure it continues to generate returns, ensuring that the people who depend on it continue to be employed. All of those are legitimate reasons to keep making something. But they are not the same as creative passion. They are not the same as having a story to tell. And for a show that began because one person had a very specific vision and a burning desire to put it on television, there is something quietly poignant about where it ended up. Section 12. The legacy of the controversy. What it all means and where the show lives now, after all of it. And after the cancellations and the revivals, and the lawsuits and the bans and the fan petitions and the Twitter feuds and the PTC complaints and the Emmy nominations and the Wednesday night time slots? What do you say about Family Guy? What is its actual legacy when you try to see it whole? The show premiered in 1999 to 22 million viewers and a genuine sense of excitement about something new arriving in the landscape of American comedy. In those first 3 seasons, it was genuinely innovative. The cutaway gag format, whatever its later discontents, was a creative invention that changed how animated comedy worked. The voice performances were extraordinary. Peter Griffin, Brian Griffin, and Stewie Griffin were original creations that didn't resemble any animated characters that had come before them. The show's willingness to go to dark places with intelligence and purpose rather than simply for shock was something that set it apart. In 2009, the Television Academy nominated Family Guy for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series. It was the first animated series to receive that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961. Nearly 50 years had passed without an animated program being considered for the highest recognition American television offers to a comedy. Family Guy broke that barrier. It lost to 30 Rock, which is not a loss to be ashamed of, but the nomination itself was a statement. The serious television world had looked at an animated comedy that spent half its runtime on cutaway gags and random non-sequiturs and said, yes, this belongs in the same conversation as the best comedies on television. In 2013, High TV Guide ranked Family Guy as the 9th greatest television cartoon of all time. These were not small recognitions. They were evidence that, whatever the later criticisms, the show had produced something of genuine lasting value in its first several seasons. The controversies that followed, the sustained abuse of Meg, the Flanderization of Peter from lovable fool to cruel man-child, the transformation of Brian from voice of reason to insufferable hypocrite, the steady replacement of storytelling with cutaway dependency, the use of shock value as a substitute for wit. These were not the same as the controversies that came from pushing creative limits. They were the controversies of a show that had stopped protecting itself. The early controversies of Family Guy, the PTC complaints, the FCC filings, the network tensions over content, the Venezuelan ban, the Carol Burnett lawsuit, the South Park feud, these were all controversies produced by a show that was doing what it believed in and suffering the consequences of that conviction in a culture that wasn't entirely ready for it. The later controversies were different in kind. They were controversies produced by a show that had lost its original creative conviction and was filling the space it left with things that were more easily produced and more safely cynical. Seth MacFarlane's departure from active creative involvement changed the show more profoundly than almost any other single factor. He had been the quality control, the person who understood why the early show worked and could make decisions that protected that. Without him actively steering, the show drifted in directions he might never have chosen. The death and resurrection of Brian, whatever else it was, felt like something that would never have happened in a writing room where MacFarlane was present and engaged. The sustained cruelty toward Meg, whatever the commercial reasoning behind it, felt like something that would not have survived contact with the creator, who had originally written her as a regular teenager who deserved better. And yet, the show's legacy is not simply one of decline, because the evidence of what it was in its best years is still there, in the episodes that remain from those first 3 seasons, and from the better episodes of the revival years. The Road to Germany, the Brian and Stewie Bank Vault episode, the Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie two-parter, Road to the Multiverse, the Simpsons crossover for all its controversies, parcels of brilliance scattered through a very long run. They remind you that the show could do extraordinary things when it committed to doing them. The show has been renewed through 2029. It will reach its 30th anniversary on Fox. It will produce somewhere in the neighborhood of 460 or more total episodes, depending on how you count the specials. It has generated multiple lawsuits, won them all. It has been banned in one country, pulled from streaming after tragedy, refused broadcast of one episode forever. It has had its creator publicly wish it was on any other network. It has killed its most beloved character and brought him back 3 weeks later. It has produced the most famous animated villain baby in television history and then slowly turned him into a relatively pleasant person. Yet it has spent roughly a decade systematically abusing its most sympathetic character and then spent another decade trying to undo the damage. It has been written by manatees, if you ask Trey Parker. It has been written by some of the sharpest comedy writers working in American television, if you ask the show's defenders. The truth is probably somewhere in between, which is where the truth usually lives. What Family Guy accomplished at its peak was real. The controversies it generated in those early years were the controversies of a show that was doing something brave and original and using the language of comedy to engage with things that other shows wouldn't touch. That is worth something. It is worth a great deal. The later controversies were the controversies of a show that had become comfortable with itself in ways that produced carelessness, laziness, and a substitution of escalation for creativity. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. A show can be genuinely groundbreaking in its early seasons and genuinely disappointing in its later ones. A show can be worth the controversy it generated at its best and worth the criticism it received at its worst. A show can be one of the most influential animated comedies in the history of American television, and also a cautionary example of what happens when commercial success outlives creative energy. Family Guy is all of those things. It always will be. The controversies are part of the record, permanent and uneditable, as the episodes themselves. And somewhere in Quahog, Rhode Island, in a fictional town that has been running on the same streets and in the same houses since January of 1999, the Griffin family keeps going. Peter is on the couch. Lois is managing the household and managing him. Meg is doing whatever Meg does in the absence of anyone paying attention to her. Chris is being himself. Stewie has an idea that may or may not involve time travel or a laser. And Brian is somewhere, being complicated. Some things never stop being complicated. And some shows never stop being impossible to look away from, no matter how many reasons they give you to try. If you are still here, thank you. Genuinely. This is the kind of story that deserves to be told slowly and with care. And I hope it was exactly that tonight. If you enjoyed this, now if you found yourself drifting through it and learning something along the way, please leave a like on the video and subscribe to Uncle Guy Lore. We are building something here, and every subscriber genuinely matters. Sleep well wherever you are tonight. I'll be here next time with something just as long and just as quiet. See you then.